So for the last 3 weeks or so, I've been using both the Blackmagic Pocket 4K and the Pocket 6K as part of a 2-camera operation and swapping the rolls back and forth to see if I could compile a list of noticeable differences between the two models when it comes to working with the cameras as well as their output, and I'd like to share that list with you today. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and welcome to the Christmas room. So let's start from the outside and work our way in. First off, the body is pretty much identical, which means that whatever rig you've put together for your 4K will likely work with the 6K. And the small rig cage that I recommended in that previous rig building video works perfectly on the 6K, but there are some cages that I believe do require some slight modifications in order to get them to work, like the tilted cage, I believe, so it's probably best to check with the model just to be sure, but the bodies are pretty much interchangeable. It's just the snout on the 6K that's different. It protrudes more and carries an EF mount, but there is a larger grill on the bottom of this snout, and it does seem to make more noise. I wouldn't call it loud, but it definitely is more audible. Here, have a listen. Just kind of has a little bit of that hum as if there was like a TV on in the room somewhere. And to speak a bit more about that EF mount, for a large portion of this comparison, I'm going to be referring to the Blackmagic Pocket 4K with the Metabone Speed Booster on, because I think that's pretty much a match made in heaven for that camera, and it also equalizes the mounts to EF for the sake of this comparison. But if you put a speed booster on the 4K, even though the mounts then become the same, the crop factor and the field of view are not. I actually just use these two cameras as examples in my crop factor video, which of course I highly recommend that you go watch, but I'll give you the final numbers here. The 4K has a crop factor of 1.9 times when using the regular Micro Four Thirds mount, but if you use the 0.71 times speed booster, that'll change your crop factor to around 1.35 times. Now there is that 0.64 times speed booster, which I don't personally love because it doesn't get along well with the Sigma 18-35, the lens that I think is the best pairing for that, because it gets a bit of vignetting on the wide end, so I would stay with the 0.71. But if you do use the 0.64 on other full frame lenses, then you'll get about a 1.2 times crop. The Pocket 6K, on the other hand, has a crop factor of 1.56 times. Now there is a focal reducer option that's going to be available for this as well, and it's by Look Adapters, and it's called the Magic Booster, and it's right now currently in a Kickstarter phase, so I haven't tested or used it at all, but it claims to give a crop factor of 1.1 times when on the camera, but of course that will only be applicable with full frame glass. So when it comes to comparing a lens like the Sigma 18-35, for now it's best to consider the Pocket 4K and Metabone Speed Booster combo a $1,950 4K 1.35 times crop camera, and the Pocket 6K a $2,500 6K 1.56 times crop factor camera. But to give you an idea of what those crop factors look like, here's 18mm and 35mm on each of these cameras with their relative crops. This will also show you the nearly 2/3 of stop of light extra that you get from the Pocket 4K when using the speed booster, which is handy, but it actually only about equals the Pocket 6K when it comes to noise. The 6K is using a larger sensor with a higher resolution, so you're definitely going to get some benefits when it comes to noise performance. And in fact, that extra bit of light from the speed booster only helps to mitigate this disparity, but when you compare the two sensors at equivalent ISOs and apertures, we can see that the 4K does indeed have more noticeable noise. Now there is one other difference regarding the mounts. The Pocket 4K has a control in the menu for the image stabilization when you pair it with a native Micro Four Thirds lens that has image stabilization. Basically you can control it within the menu, but you can't do this on the Pocket 6K. I paired it with a native EF Canon lens that does have image stabilization, but there's no option in the menu to turn it on or off, so you basically can only control it on the lens. But if you use the speed booster on the Pocket 4K to make it an EF mount, then you're pretty much in the same boat again, because that option in the menu on the 4K is no longer available when you're using an adapted lens. So at that point, the cameras basically become the same thing. Each one will only be able to control the image stabilization on the lens and not have an option in the menu. And the stabilization does work, it's just that you lose that functionality that's different on the 4K that you would get if you were using a native Micro Four Thirds lens. But of course, keep in mind that with the speed booster, the 4K will have a wider field of view using the same lens, which often makes a shot seem more stable if that's the look that you're going for. The ports on the camera are the same, which means that accessories and connectivity is the same, and this includes power, as both cameras are using the same Canon LPE6 battery, and both chew through that battery pretty quickly. But both of them also accept the same 12-volt 2-pin external power source, and the AC adapters that come in the box are the same 12-volt 2.5 amp version. The USB ports are also rated the same on the two cameras at USB 3.1 Gen 1, even though the Pocket 6K has higher data rates, which means that there are considerations to make when recording the SSD on the Pocket 6K. 6K. I've had no issues when recording to the 1TB Samsung T5 on the Pocket 4K at max resolution and frame rate at Q0. In fact, that's what I recommend using on that camera because I haven't had a single drop frame, and typically constant quality is the best choice to use when you can. However, I have had issues recording to the Pocket 6K to the 1TB Samsung T5 at max resolution and frame rate, so 6K 50 frames per second at Q0 on this camera. I do get drop frames. And we can see why if we look at the data rates advertised by Blackmagic. On the 4K, the Q0 reaches a maximum of 203 megabytes per second, which is well under what you can do with the Samsung T5. I did some speed tests on the T5 as well as some other drives using USB 3.1 Gen 1, and my average was about 450 megabytes per second with sequential write. But if we look at the data rates for the Blackmagic Pocket 6K on Q0, they can reach up to 483 megabytes per second, and it's likely what causes the occasional frame drops. So if 100% frame integrity is important to you, I'd recommend dropping down to 5:1 compression ratio on this camera when shooting high frame rate 6K. Okay, a little update on what I just said. When I was filming some B-roll for this video, I was able to create a repeatable frame drop scenario that allows me to better define the usage scenario for shooting those high frame rate 6K. Here's what I discovered. I only ever get frame drops when I'm in that higher gain circuit, so ISO 1250 and above. When I'm shooting at ISO 1000 and below, it doesn't drop frames even at Q0 or 3:1 at 6K 50 frames per second. I was able to test this by enabling the option in the camera that stops recording if it detects a frame drop, and when the following conditions were met, it would stop recording every time around 9 to 10 seconds. So here's the conditions. If you're recording using the higher gain circuit, so again, ISO 1250 and beyond, and you're at max resolution 6K and using a frame rate higher than 30 frames a second, so either setting it to 50 frames per second normally or setting it to one of those in-camera slow motion like 48 frames per second down to 24p. In either case, if you're over 30 frames per second on the higher gain circuit and using either Q0 or 3:1, it'll drop a frame and stop recording. If you switch down to 5:1 or Q5, you're fine. And you can even do all that stuff again, 6K, 50 frames a second or 48 frames a second, and at Q0 or 3:1 as long as you're at ISO 1000 or below. So it's kind of an odd usage case, but I think it's important to know. Basically, if you plan on shooting using the higher gain circuit at 6K, just make sure they're at 30 frames a second or below if you want to use Q0 or 3:1. But if you want to shoot at 6K with 48 or 50 frames a second and use the higher gain circuit, then you're going to want to switch down to a 5:1 ratio. Okay, back to the video. The menus are pretty much identical between these two cameras except for the obvious resolution differences. This one has 6K resolution choices, but something that you should be aware of is that the 4K resolutions on this camera are not available for Blackmagic RAW. You have to use ProRes. The Blackmagic RAW option is available for all the 6K as well as the anamorphic options and the 2.8K super slow motion choice, but the 4K DCI, the Ultra HD, and even the standard 1080p are ProRes only options on this camera. Now obviously if you're planning on shooting 4K RAW exclusively, then it makes more sense to probably buy the Pocket 4K, but it's definitely something you should be aware of. Okay, so I think that's everything regarding using the camera parts. Now let's talk about the differences in the image. So obviously the major difference here is that one of these cameras is 6K, but it's hard to state the importance of this resolution change because it depends wildly on how you're distributing your video and how it's being viewed. For instance, if you plan to put this to YouTube 4K and most of the people that watch it are going to be viewing it on their phones, you're not going to see much of a difference in the 6K over the 4K. The most you'll see is that the 6K is just a hair sharper or more detailed, but usually this is only visible when you zoom in. However, that also reveals the biggest advantage of the 6K in my opinion if you plan on reframing or punching in post. You're going to be able to zoom in by 160% without losing any quality. If we compare the 6144 horizontal resolution against the 3840 on the Pocket 4K, that's a 1.6 times extra crop that you can take without any reduction in quality, making this much more flexible in post. And you also get a higher resolution for your 120 frames per second work if slow motion is important to you, getting you up to 2.8K on the 6K for that 120p. But there's more to an image than just resolution, so I also checked if the color, white balance, raw workflow, and exposure were the same between the two cameras. And the answer is almost. The workflow is identical, and the exposure tools on the camera give the same results, but I did notice a slight difference in the curve between the two cameras. The 6K seems to reel in the highlights a tad more and requires a gain or highlight bump to match the 4K. I also found the white balance to be slightly different as well, with the Pocket 6K coming in about 100 Kelvin cooler than the 4K, which actually makes the 6K a tad more congruent with other cameras. The color is also extremely similar, but again, I found the 6K to be just a tad better, or in this case, a tad more accurate. So overall, I'd suggest that the image performance is very similar between these two cameras, but the Pocket 6K probably does have about a 5% improvement over the 4K, but they're very easy to match in post with just some minor adjustments. The whole time I was doing these tests, I kept asking myself, if I didn't own either of these cameras, which one would I buy today? And to be honest, it's really hard to say. Both are a terrific value and each offer a compelling argument. The Pocket 4K is an affordable camera, an absolute pleasure to use, and pretty much a game changer in its category. But the 6K is impressively priced as well, and I think that if the 4K didn't exist, we'd be revering this camera in the same light as we do the 4K now when it comes to value. And you get the same incredible workflow and just all-around enjoyable shooting experience on the 6K thanks to the continuity and design between it and the 4K. So you really can't go wrong. The simple advice would be that if you don't need 6K, get the 4K. The image out of the 4K is still very impressive and you can get a lot done with it. If, however, post-cropping is important to you, you want higher res slow motion, or you just want to squeeze the most detail that you can out of $2,500, the 6K is the answer. But if you're somebody that has the 4K already and you're watching this video to find out if the 6K would be an easy companion for it, rest assured, they'll get along perfectly. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright, I'm done.